Okay, so next is sauerkraut, and I'm also going to do fermented brine because these are the fermented dairy, fermented brine, and sauerkraut are the first ferments that you introduce when you're doing GAPS intro or a gut reset style diet. Usually, actually, in the GAPS book, she says to introduce ferments almost immediately or as soon as the initial diarrhea has stopped, sometimes within a few days. I usually have people wait a week or two just because I want that gut lining to really start to seal before we bring in new bacteria. And often people go through such intense die-off in their first week on the diet that adding ferments to it it seems like a lot. It seems like a lot to manage because every time you bring in good bacteria, you're basically bringing in a little army, and you're going to kill off more of the bad guys, and it's going to create more die-off symptoms, which can be very unpleasant, although they are necessary. We want to pace that as much as possible. So the first thing you will introduce is fermented brine, and that's basically like fermented vegetable salt water. Now, it in liquid form is going to be easiest on the digestion, and it's still very, very powerful. If you're drinking your ferment, like you're drinking fermented water, basically, that's going to be easiest on your gut lining. Then usually fermented dairy is brought in, usually first fermented sour cream, or fermented cream, I should say, which I'm also going to do a demo on. That's because it's mostly fat, and so it's likely to be tolerated best. Usually people who have issues with dairy have issues with either the lactose sugar or the casein protein. And so something like fermented cream is usually tolerated best because you have fermented out any lactose still in it, and because it's mostly fat, you don't really have much protein in it. So you start with that, and then you go to yogurt or kefir. And then you bring in sauerkraut or the actual fermented vegetable last, because even though it's fermented, it's still raw, right? It's been broken down by bacteria, so it's easier to digest than just plain raw cabbage, for example. You definitely want to wait a while before you do any raw vegetables when you're trying to heal the gut. But a fermented vegetable is still going to be harder on your gut than the fermented water or the fermented dairy. So you want to wait until you've done a bit of healing before you bring that in. But I'm going to show you how to make the brine and the sauerkraut for now. Okay, so I have garlic, and I'm going to use this for the brine, and I have cabbage that I am going to use for the sauerkraut. Now, as always, with vegetables, organic is ideal. If you can get produce from like a farmer's market where you are buying from small farms who really care about their farming practices and are doing it for personal values and things like that, that's ideal because you're going to be able to trust them and their farming practices the most. Of course, there's obviously an accessibility issue and a price issue for a lot of people, so just do whatever you can afford. If you just have to go to a supermarket, just try to buy organic when you can, or if you can't buy organic, try to buy off the Clean 15 list that the EWG puts out. These are the foods that are that absorb the least amount of pesticides from the soil, so they're safest to eat non-organic if that's your only option. And that list changes every year, so because they do new measurements every year, so check that out. Alright, I'm going to chop this garlic, and I should say I'm going to peel this garlic. I don't actually chop it up when I'm making brine, I just leave the cloves whole. And that is going to make a very potent garlicky brine. So, to make brine, you need a jar. Always the jar. I collect and save jars wherever I go. And then you want to, for the brine, I like to make garlic brine. So, put the garlic in. You just need to fill it up like a quarter of the way. There doesn't have to be very many vegetables in it. And then the rest of the way with water, because this kind of fermentation is an anaerobic process. And that means that it does not happen with oxygen. So, you need to cover it with water so that the oxygen does not disrupt the process. 2 tablespoons per quart. No, wait, 1 tablespoon per quart. And this is half a quart. So I'm only going to do half a tablespoon. I think I've been doing more than that with the recipe I was using, so I'm really interested to see if this ferment is going to be stronger. The reason you add salt is because salt suppresses the growth of the opportunistic bacteria, but it's not very suppressing to the healthy bacteria, like the lactic acid making bacteria, the lactobacillus bacteria that we want to grow, that is really beneficial for the gut. And that being said, if you are prone to panic attacks, you want to wait until those subside before you do anything fermented, because it means you have too much lactic acid in your body anyway, so we don't want to introduce lactic acid producing bacteria, even though there's other benefits to those. There's a lot of benefits to those bacteria strains, but it just means there's too much of an imbalance there, and we need to settle that first. So you need to wait to introduce ferments until that settles. You just close it up. And usually what I do is I just shake it daily to make sure that the garlic floating on the top doesn't form mold. If you do that, I've never had a problem with mold with these. And even if it does have mold, the mold's not dangerous. You just scrape it off and it's fine. But I've never had an issue with it. And what'll happen is you set this out at room temperature on your counter, and tomorrow, maybe the next day, but usually within 12 hours you start to see the bubbles coming up, and when you open it, it's like a little soda. It's like a little carbonated fermented soda. Everything's all bubbly and effervescent, and that's the fermentation happening. And so we didn't use a starter with this because it's just a wild fermentation. There is just bacteria on plants, even the ones you buy in a grocery store. And so that bacteria that's on there already is beneficial and going to be proliferating all on its own. So now I'm going to do the sauerkraut. So I got a baked cabbage here. So you can make beet ferment, you could make a broccoli ferment. I've done that before. I didn't really like how it tasted though. You could use different herbs and spices. I know a lot of people like to put fennel or caraway seeds in their ferments. I wouldn't do that if you're in early stages of healing the gut. It's a little too irritating. But you could do raw ginger. That gives a really nice flavor. Some people do fennel. That gives a nice flavor as well. So you can make any combination. The classic one is just cabbage. And what you want to do, you can do this in a food processor if you want. Although I am going to leave one leaf out for later. I'll tell you why then. So you want to chop it pretty thin. The thinner it is, the easier it will ferment, or the more it will ferment. The less the bacteria will have to break down, and it'll get nice and soft. So you want to slice it pretty thin. You could also use a food processor to kind of shred it, especially if you have low time and energy. That's a good option. I'm going to try to stuff this all into a quart's worth. So I'm going to use a tablespoon of salt. Again, we use salt because it helps the opportunistic bacteria kind of be suppressed, so that the good bacteria, the lactic acid producing bacteria that we want, can proliferate. And we're just using a wild fermentation. Now you can use a starter. You can use whey, which is that it's the liquid that you see like on the top of your yogurt when it's starting to separate. That's the whey, and it's very probiotic rich. Dairy liquid, basically like dairy liquid. And you can use like half a cup of that in your sauerkraut as a starter. But it's really not necessary. You can very easily just do a wild fermentation. I'm going to sprinkle about a tablespoon of salt on this. and just kind of mix it together. Mix that salt in. Oh, the other reason that you put salt in your ferment is actually not just to suppress the opportunistic bacteria. The other reason is that it draws water out. And we need to make a brine with this. I mean, obviously we intentionally made a water brine, but we do need some water to cover the cabbage because, again, the fermentation is an anaerobic process. It cannot be exposed to oxygen. So we need a little bit of natural brine in there with it. How we do that is we just kind of pound this cabbage in there. So we're going to put some of this cabbage in here. You can use a spoon or a mallet, and we're just kind of going to just be a little rough with it. Some people like to massage the cabbage before they put it in. I don't have a good bowl where I am, so I'm just going to make do with kind of punching it with a spoon. But you could use like a mallet. If you have like a wooden pole or something, you could use that. And you really want to punch it down because, again, you really don't want air pockets. So you can get pretty aggressive punching it down. And if you're really weak or sick or low energy, you may need a friend or a family member to help you with this. I was only making fermented brine when I was really sick. I wouldn't have been able to do this. It would have been too much energy for me. You can actually fit a surprising amount of cabbage in here. You punch it down like that. But I might have some left over. Use my, get your fist in there. Use that. Fermentation is a really important skill. This is a universal food in traditional diets. Every traditional culture in the world that they have documented has some type of fermented food that they eat, animal or plant. And if they don't ferment plants because they don't have enough plants in their diet, they ferment animal foods. They ferment dairy and they even ferment meat. In traditional societies in Northern Europe, they fermented fish over the winter, and a lot of other type of like Scandinavian and even Inuit cultures, they have something called high meat, which is fermented meat. So there's something really obviously powerful and important about fermented foods. Not only do they keep well, they don't spoil, but they must provide something really healing because people go way out of their way to ferment foods in every culture around the world. So this is a staple of a traditional diet. The ferments you buy at the store, even the high quality ones, are going to be weak. Usually they're not fermented very long because they're worried about contamination, they're worried about shelf life, all that stuff, which is so ironic because it's actually the longer you ferment something, the safer it is. But, standards of the food industry, not particularly based on science. So, yeah, even when you buy high quality ferments at the store, they're just not going to be very strong. And so if you really want a therapeutic level fermented food, you've got to make it yourself. And it's really, really simple. I'm spending a couple hours tonight doing all of this, and I'm going to have more fermented food than I know what to do with. No, I'm going to eat it all. I don't know what I'm talking about. Now, this will expand a little bit. So with this last punch down, I'm going to leave that be. Because I don't want this sauerkraut to leak as it's bubbling and fermenting. Now, I'm not happy with the amount of brine I was able to make doing it this way without my special tools. Although you can see, when I push it down, you can see the water. but it's just not quite enough to cover it, and that's really important. Remember, we don't want it to get moldy. I'm gonna put a little more water in here. Then, this leaf I left. This is going to be my little weight. Now, I do have glass weights at my house that I love. Little glass weights for my fermentation, but I am not at my house. They're in storage. So here I am, playing around with cabbage leaves. But, it does make a nice little weight. Just stick that in there. And it keeps all the cabbage from floating up. Push that down. Those air bubbles out. Alright, that's pretty good. Ta-da!